Hey everyone, this is Tyler. This is going to be the third video of four on South-South cooperation. That is international development cooperation that occurs or takes place between countries of the Global South or institutions and organizations of the Global South. So this is a video for my IDS 2103 class at the University of New Brunswick, which is a class on the institutions and actors of international development. So this video in particular is going to be on multilateral development banks. In the previous two videos, we looked at the origins of South-South cooperation, kind of as a concept. We talked about the non-aligned movement, the Bandung Conference, and all of that. And in that video, we saw that South-South cooperation really emerges in this post-war period with lots of spirit, a lot of desire to say to the world, you know, we are the South. We're not going to enter into these new neo-colonial relations of domination. We're going to pursue our own development objectives, however those are defined, in solidarity with each other, working together to build our own institutions and to move forward together. Then in our second video, we looked at some of these new and emerging donors, particularly the BRICS, to see how is it that they are acting. You know, we saw that those concepts of Bandung, of solidarity, of all this good stuff. How are they acting? And we saw that really, in my opinion, there's not much of a difference in how they conduct themselves compared to the West or Western donors. If anything, they're more upfront about their desires to have mutual benefit, mutual political and economic benefits, much more so than Western donors. Now, is this because of solidarity amongst each other? You know, maybe not, but it's definitely interesting, and China in particular is going to be a big donor for years to come, and taken together, South-South cooperation and these new emerging donors is signaling a decline or a relative decline in significance of Westerners like me in international development. I think that's a good thing. But I think these videos kind of make clear that the direction everything is going isn't necessarily any different than business as usual. And maybe for you, that's good. If you love capitalist development, that's good for you. So yeah, this video is going to be on multilateral development banks, which are these institutions that provide money for development around the world that are owned by or controlled by two or more countries. These institutions make resources available for development, so we're going to look at them. That being said, how much does development cost? People, you know, I have some books here on my shelf, The Bottom Billion and others, and people talk about the amount of resources that are actually required to make the world not poor, to make development happen, however that's possible. If you believe the reason that there's poverty around the world is because we haven't spent enough money on it, maybe you know that's, I guess, up for debate. We've never spent the money people claim is required, but one estimate is that it might cost anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion to achieve even the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. That would eliminate poverty and do all these other good things. As we're going to see in this video, the money that's coming out of all of the multilateral development banks combined is nowhere near this amount. So it's not enough. But you know, it is significant. There's money being spent, and these banks do represent an interest by countries around the world, regions around the world, to pursue development, and it's worth looking at. Because this is a video made for a university course, we are looking at the readings from weeks 11 and 12 for these videos. This video in particular is going to use a lot of the awesome charts and graphs from the Faré, Prezant, and Rogerson reading. Those are a little out to date. I'm sure I could have found better or more up-to-date information, but I did not find anything that was as comprehensive, I guess, and group them together in an effective way. And I don't think things would have changed that much from the years, whatever, was it 2014 or 15 data, something like that. It's a few years out of date. But anyway, I think it's good for our purposes. That being said, let's get started. So again, these are institutions, multilateral development banks that are owned by 2 or more countries that provide financial assistance to developing countries in order to promote development. We've already talked about the World Bank in this course, which is a global development bank. Nowadays, there's a second global development bank, which is the BRICS-owned New Development Bank. So I don't know a tremendous amount about this. It began in 2015, but the World Bank we know, has members from around the world. It provides, it has different lending facilities, but it provides money to low, middle-income countries, and it certainly kind of set the agenda for development financing. So that's why we looked at it in this course. But there's many other multilateral development banks out there that aren't as global in nature. And in this video, we're going to look more at the ones that are Southern-owned or primarily Southern-owned. There's going to be a little bit more slides in this video. So this is just a list of some of these multilateral, or pretty much there's going to be another slide with some more names, but these are multilateral development banks here. European Investment Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, an Asian Development Bank, a European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a Development Bank of Latin America, Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the New Development Bank, that's the BRICS one, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that's primarily a Chinese-owned bank, the Arab Petroleum Investment Corporation, which I'd never heard about before making this video, and the Eastern and Southern African Trade Development Bank, or the Trade and Development Bank. So this is a list of sub-regional development banks. We're going to talk about that here in a second. So the Caribbean Development Bank, the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, and so on. The big difference between multilateral development banks and sub-regional development banks is that this list you see on the screen here, these sub-regional or these regional development banks, is that these banks are owned and controlled 100% by the people that are borrowing money from them. Those other banks that we looked at, those have non-borrowing members on their boards that own shares in the bank. So it makes things very different. We looked at the World Bank, we looked at the World Bank group, and we saw that, of course, it's owned and controlled primarily by Western non-borrowing countries, and that has historically created some tensions within the organization and dramatically affected the way they conduct their business. So there are banks out there that are controlled 100% by people that are borrowing money from them. So these are just some of those acronyms, because some of these charts we're going to use have lots of acronyms on there. So this is a chart showing kind of the dates that a few of these key banks emerged. Sorry, just taking me a second here. So you see that there's a lot of expansion in the 1960s. That makes sense. Our previous video, we talked about that independence era was a major time of excitement of institutional development for South-South cooperation. And then there's a pretty big hiatus. I guess the banks are already created. And then you see the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the New Development Bank in 2015. So the New Development Bank is that BRICS bank, and the AIB is a primarily Chinese-controlled bank. So these are pretty significant, but an indication of Chinese investment in multilateral development banks. So this is another slide just showing the amount of members that are in some of these different banks, broken down by regional members and non-regional members or other institutions. So some of these banks have private sector members. Most of the banks have mostly countries sitting as members of their banks. At the top, IBRD and IDA, which are the main arms of the World Bank Group. Obviously, you see as you get as you go down, the amount of members of these banks declines because, of course, the IBRD and IDA are more global in nature. They don't have the New Development Bank on here, but obviously African Development Bank is quite big. Asian Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, but you get to the bottom, and the Central American banks, for example, are going to have fewer members. And the non-regional members are typically Western countries or people like richer countries that are not borrowing. Usually the non-regional members are non-borrowing members. So financing. One of the arguments for multilateral development banks is, of course, there is a need for investment to achieve development. Why? Countries, poor countries do not have the savings required to invest in their private sector or to invest in revenue generating strategies that will make them self-sufficient, so they need to get money. So they go elsewhere. They can go to private banks or they can go to multilateral development banks. In general, however, these banks, multilateral development banks, are kind of fulfilling a purpose because a lot of these countries, poor countries in particular, don't have the credit worthiness or they don't have the credit rating required to get cheap money on the international financial markets. They can't borrow at cheap enough rates. They might be able to borrow at rates or a certain rate, or a company from a country might be able to borrow at a certain rate, but they're not going to be able to generate profits enough to counteract that. So maybe they're borrowing at rates that kind of gobble up all their profits. So what's the point of lending at all in that case? So what multilateral development banks are able to do is basically step in with that financing. And part of the goal of these, the kind of the longer term goal, is that when these banks step in and fulfill that function, maybe other private sector banks are going to come in with that lending. Maybe these multilateral development banks, they say, will be able to leverage other money, but then also get the private sector to kind of get on board lending in these areas. We'll see how effective, well, we're not really going to see whether or not private sector money is really followed or not, but the idea is that these banks are basically able to use the finances they have to lend cheaper than the private sector can to these countries. So what kind of financing? They can give that grant-based and concessional ODA type financing for sure, that gold standard of charitable money, but that's not a super common thing they do. Most of these multilateral development banks are not giving a huge amount of official development assistance, basically fairly free money. Most of them are giving non-concessional or at least market-based loans. These organizations can also provide project-based or policy loans. So project-based loans is straightforward. That's lending to projects, typically a private sector infrastructure project, or these can be policy loans. So these are loans, remember that week, the week we talked about structural adjustment. These can be loans that are contingent on governments. So these usually go to governments, you can see below. The type of financing these agencies are giving can go to governments or it can go to a company. We could be sitting there in Eritrea and apply for a loan from the African Development Bank if we have certain things in place. But policy loans are contingent on kind of some policy change or a behavioral change from government. So, this is for some tax reform, all the things you need to do to hire consultants, to implement a strategy, to do all the training, whatever you need to do that particular reform. But that's typically goes to governments. That wouldn't be something that's relevant to the private sector. So back to what I said about credit ratings. On the left-hand side, you have a credit rating, and on the right-hand side, you have some acronyms. So some of you are probably starting to get in the mail credit cards, right? You don't really have much of a credit, but you're basically starting to build your credit. You can have good credit, you can have bad credit like me. So in terms of financial institutions and countries can have kind of AAA ratings, they can have BB ratings, and the ratings go even lower, but AAA is the highest you can have. And basically, when you have a AAA rating, you're able to borrow money cheaper. You're lower risk. So people are going to say, well, we're only going to ask, 3% or 4% interest or whatever from you because you are credit worthy. We're pretty sure we're going to get this money back. It's not very risky. Double B, people are going to start saying, oh my God, Tyler, you don't pay your bills on time. You got all these student loans. We're going to charge you 21% interest. So that's not the real ratio, but all that to say is that affects how cheaply countries or organizations can borrow money. Up there you see Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the IBD, the World Bank Group. These organizations have AAA ratings. They can get money basically as cheap as they can. At the bottom, you see much lower rates. So when these organizations turn around and relend money, so basically what these organizations are doing is they're using the financial backing of the countries that back them. Many of them, especially at the top, have a lot of Western countries backing them up. So with that kind of backing, their rating is strong because they're backed up and guaranteed by all of these rich and powerful countries. The more the merrier, it seems. Whereas at the lower end of that spectrum, in the double B, the triple B, and A, those have smaller groups of people backing them up. And also, these are usually poorer countries, so they don't have the economic power that the other countries have. And that affects how cheaply they can borrow money. And what these banks are doing is they're borrowing money cheap and usually relending at a slightly higher rate. So they're basically borrowing on international markets, relending that money to other countries to pursue their development, and they're earning a little bit of a cut that they then use to pay their staff, pay their bills, and hopefully one day repay the loans and even generate new financing for more loans in the future. So how much money are we talking about that these organizations are dealing with? So look at that. The left-hand side there is capital and the money up in the billions. So IBRD, for example, way up there with almost $250 billion. Asian Development Bank, 150. African Development Bank getting toward 100. So remember we talked about how there might be a need for $2 to $3 trillion. This is not, up by $3 trillion by any means. This isn't every multilateral development bank either, and this does not include private sector lending that may be happening, right? Morgan Stanley Bank or whatever bank you can imagine might have lending around the world. So important to realize the difference between subscribed and paid-in capital. Subscribed can also be called callable capital. Now, what that means is that this is basically the amount of money all the countries got together and basically subscribed or bought shares in the bank. Now, this subscribed capital is money they technically owe to the bank and could be called upon at any time. In general, I don't know if any multilateral development bank has ever actually called in the subscribed capital, but basically this is the bedrock these institutions are using to make those loans. So when they turn around to the private sector, the African Development Bank is saying, listen, we got $90 billion guaranteed from Europe and all these other countries. We're good for the money. So, but that is not something they need to pay in, but they might need to at one time if things get tough. If these organizations make some bad loans and whatever, the African Development Bank might have to go to their shareholders and say, we had a horrible quarter or horrible year. We basically need that $20 billion you said you were going to give us. Paid in is what actually needed to be paid in. So you can see that's a very small amount of money for most of these banks. It's nothing in the European bank there, the European Investment Bank and the IBRD, and very little for almost every bank. So that constitutes a very small amount of money that actually needs to be paid in. But that is money that is used to secure loans, to pay bills and whatever. But most of these banks are hoping that their economic model is that with these subscriptions, by selling shares to these different countries, they're going to be able to conduct their business and conduct it profitably, so they can continue their mandate of providing resources to countries and companies that need it. So that's in general. This is an annual look at how much money is being. This is how much money they're actually spending in operations per year. So as you can see, it's much smaller than that larger amount we had seen. The IBRD, part of the World Bank Group, is the highest with over 15 billion a year. And remember in class when we did that data exercise, we saw the loans, and you can go on the World Bank website and look at where all these loans are spent through an interactive map. It's really cool. But yeah, so some of these banks, you know, $5–10 billion, Inter-American Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, so not insignificant amounts of money in terms of annual disbursements. Look how small the ODA amount is. So it's nothing for many of these banks. The European Investment Bank, it's actually quite large. IDA, remember the IDA, the part of the World Bank, that is only available for low-income countries. So the IDA is pretty much where all of the ODA type of funding goes through. The IBRD, that's more for middle countries. So Nigeria and Turkey are not going to the IDA. Chad and South Sudan are going to be going through the IDA. The African Development Bank, of course, being in Africa, where a lot of the world's poorest countries are, is giving quite a lot of ODA. So, interesting. What about governance? So, we saw that amount of money that was there, and this is just some of the banks, and this is voting share broken down by borrowing and non-borrowing countries. So the light blue is non-borrowing countries. So IBRD, the World Bank Group, and IDA, that's the World Bank Group. Obviously, we know historically these are controlled primarily by non-borrowing countries. So pretty much Western countries are determining the terms and the organizational structure and the priorities of all of this lending that goes on. Asian Development Bank, still 62% non-borrowing. That's European countries. EBRD, obviously, Europe, mostly non-borrowing countries. The Inter-American Development Bank, 50-50. CAF in Central Africa, 100%. That's a sub-regional development bank. The Islamic Development Bank, 100% borrowing countries. So other countries have similar models, right? The sub-regional development banks are going to be controlled by the borrowing countries. But the idea is, especially when we spend a lot of time in this course looking at the World Bank and IMF and how that governance affects the lending and the policies of those organizations, the argument is, and what people say the value these multilateral development banks bring to development, is that they're more democratic, they're more equal, they're going to be more responsive to the needs of the people that are borrowing money, maybe more understanding. And maybe as well, we mentioned in the new and emerging donor section, maybe it's the case that because these organizations are controlled by these countries, they're going to have some competitive advantage too. Maybe they're going to have more contextual knowledge and experience and be able to be more responsive and make better decisions. Whereas, you know, if you're the World Bank or the IMF or whatever, IDA, you're hiring people like Tyler Foley, right? Mr. Whiterson, who's from Canada, who, you know, has a PhD in economics and all this stuff. Whereas maybe the argument goes, by having a different kind of organizational structure, having different policies, priorities, you might hire different people, you might do different things, and you might just have a better structure that works out better for your clients. I just wanted to put this slide. This was an interesting paper prepared for very recent paper. I think only created 2 or 3 months ago, created for Congress. And it just shows the voting power, U.S. voting power in some of the different MDBs. And that red line is the amount needed to exercise vetoes. So remember, in a lot of these organizations, decisions are made according to votes. You have shareholders. So the amounts of, you get your money by distributing shares, and those shares correspond to voting power within the organization. Now, famously, in the IBRD, the United States, as you can see there, has a veto. It has a veto, and the fact that they have just enough to have a veto is not an accident. That's an intentionally designed institutional feature of the IBRD to make sure that the United States can veto any decision at any time. And over time, the amount of decisions that are worthy of becoming or veto worthy has also increased to basically maintain, despite the growing power of other countries economically, and even in terms of voting share in the IBRD, the United States has been able to maneuver so that they can still maintain a lot of power. They don't have a veto in the IDA. But then look at the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. You know, so they don't have vetoes. They don't have vetoes everywhere. But again, there's all kinds of jockeying and politics that plays out in these organizations, right? So just looking at US voting power maybe doesn't mean anything. Maybe you have to look at Western voting power, and who knows? All kinds of politics and exchanges go on in these organizations. But just in general, the whole point is that in these regional development banks and multilateral development banks, the whole point is that Western power is diminished. So with all that said, are these banks that are more free from the constraints of the West using their newfound powers to do anything radically different in terms of the way they function or operate? So this is a list of mandates and mission statements from the different banks. Only the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank actually have poverty eradication as their main goal. All the others say sustainable development. I would just love a bank to be like, we want unsustainable capitalist accumulation. And that's what we want. But basically, these are a list of the mandates, but in general, development, right? And the World Bank, Asian Development Bank actually say poverty eradication, which is a little bit of a slight difference. I doubt it really makes much of a difference, but again, the World Bank does have the IDA, right? They're basically giving out free, more or less free money. So you can take a look at those. But all this to say, the mandates and mission statements are not very different. I don't even think this is an argument. I think it's a statement that these banks are really, and a lot of the stuff they're lending to is the private sector, and they're hoping, they're banks, they want to see returns on their investments, and they want the countries they're lending to and the companies they're lending to get into such a financial position that they hopefully don't need to rely on loans, or that they can get even cheaper loans from the private sector in the future. So they are looking to basically increase the economic power, the economic growth, the development potential over all of these regions. And of course, over time, we've heard this new progressive language of human development, sustainable development. But development, economic development, is really at the core. But most of these organizations have some kind of, they're saying our priorities are multifaceted. It's human and sustainable and inclusive and feminist and all of these things that are good in economic development. So this is the high fives, the African Union priorities, which I really like. In class, I think I showed this already in class, and they had like the hand with the high five infographics. So the priority areas: light up and power Africa, universal access to electricity, infrastructure based, but also very related to human development and the human quality of life. Feed Africa, agricultural transformation. Last video we talked about pro-savanna, right? That's development. Give 6 million hectares to a Brazilian company. That's development. It'll feed Africa. So again, there's a lot of, the way these things play out. It's hard to debate with Feed Africa, but how do these play out? Industrialize Africa, economic diversification, integrate Africa, regional market integration, and improve the quality of life for the people of Africa, access to social and economic opportunities. So this is multifaceted. It's basically everything. But this is guiding the objectives for the next few years for the African Development Bank. So they want to focus on electricity. They want to focus on, and again, we looked at the Bui Dam at the last one. Now that was Chinese money, but that's the kind of thing that the African Development Bank is, and many other banks are looking for. Big infrastructure projects. There's infrastructure, if you're making roads, if you're making railways, if you're improving power grids, that's going to make business easier to do. It's going to lower the cost of doing business. It's going to make hopefully your products cheaper, make them more competitive on international markets. So this is a nice little interesting graph just to kind of show the way these things tie together within the African Development Bank. And regional market, I do like this just because it really does show so many different things at once. So this is the Inter-American Development Bank. Try not to use my slides so much this video, but basically the priorities of the Inter-American Development Bank are regional integration, regional market integration. I know I shouldn't be touching my face. It's March 26th. I'm terrified of COVID, but my face is so itchy and dry. So the priorities of the Inter-American Development Bank are basically something to do with social development and inclusion, something to do with productivity and economic growth, and then something to do with regional integration. And now this is a look on the left-hand side, projects by country. So how many projects they have in each country. So you can see this is the Inter-American Development Bank, which is one of the world's biggest banks. Brazil is one of their biggest growers. And Brazil, again, remember, Brazil is a member of BRICS. They're a major shareholder in this new development bank of BRICS. They're a donor. They're giving money. They're trying to do all kinds of things around the world. They're one of the biggest recipients of the Inter-American Development Bank. They are, at one hand, a borrower and a lender of money. They're also lending to this bank, right? Argentina, a ton. Paraguay, Uruguay, Peru, Ecuador, Haiti, Bolivia, and it goes down from there. Jamaica at the end. Shout out to Christina. So on the other column, we have projects by sector. Reform and modernization of the state. So that could be project-based, but it could very well be policy-based loans. So those could be taxation schemes. They could be all kinds of different things that are reforming or modernizing the state. Who knows what all the different things that could entail. But look high up there, transport, water and sanitation. So of course, water and sanitation could be good for human beings and human development, quality of life. Then you have social investment. So that could be like early childhood development. That could be conditional cash transfers, which are very big in South America and in the Americas. We are supposed to be talking about those in class. Our last week, we're going to look at conditional cash transfers. We won't now, but we do have a required reading from week 13 for that. Going down, agriculture, rural development, environment, natural disasters, financial markets. But look at social investment. Look at health. Look at education. So it's not insignificant, but the big spending is really happening when you add it up in terms of all the projects in more infrastructure related things. At the same time, kind of contemporary new trade theory and new economic theory really does say at the same time, like these countries are not, and the people making policies in these countries are very aware that it isn't just infrastructure nowadays. There's so many things. Economic growth and the growth of regions and areas is so contingent on your human resource capacity, on the knowledge economies, and the new kind of economy that is being generated out there in the world is very dependent on high quality human resources. So you do need to invest in human beings. So it makes sense, even from a strictly economic perspective nowadays, that you need to invest in human beings and you need to invest in education in particular. But just to say, all of this lending is prioritizing infrastructure, prioritizing the state, and that's stuff that maybe you got into development for, that health, education, and fuzzy feeling stuff. is sometimes pretty low on the priorities when compared with economic development. I have not looked at my slides for a while, so I've got to, oh my God. It's my first time ever using a computer, so I'm pretty far away. 1 second. Yeah, the priorities for the Inter-American Development Bank: social exclusion and inequality, to fight those, I imagine, low productivity and innovation, and lack of regional economic integration. So those are the challenges that they're trying to address. So we're getting to the conclusion here. So what is the relationship between these multilateral development banks and the World Bank group that we've looked at? And in general, it is good. The World Bank is happy to have more lending out there. Their goal is to eradicate poverty and to promote development. And so they are happy that countries and companies in the global south have more financing opportunities. That's the ultimate goal. And in fact, they work together and they co-finance projects together. So be certain that within these banks, they're talking with each other. They probably have some formalized coordination meetings and committees or staff, specifically set aside to coordinate amongst each other. But in general, it's a good relationship, and they're happy to have them. And that goes with most Western countries. That being said, when the Asian Infrastructure Bank was created and the New Development Bank was created, the United States was not happy. So those were created in 2015, and I wrote a quote somewhere. So former U.S. Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers, when it was established, said, and I quote, "This past month may be remembered as the moment the United States lost its role as the underwriter of the global economic system." So a former U.S. Treasury Secretary, someone high up there in the United States government, basically looked at these new development banks that were controlled by China, that were controlled by the BRICS, the New Development Bank trying to replace basically the World Bank group and undermine the Bretton Woods system. Well, I'm using the word undermine, but they use the language of complement and create their own institutions. Someone within the US government looked at it and said, this is a disaster. It basically signals the end of our political influence. That is not the role of other people. Joseph Stiglitz, for example, who is a senior economist at the World Bank, one of the most knowledgeable, at the World Bank, one of the most knowledgeable economists out there in terms of the World Bank, said, this is all good if you like capital accumulation, increased global trade, and so on. So, and the United States concerns was that this Asian Development Bank, for example, China has a 29% voting share. India has an 8% voting share, and 77% of the votes are from southern borrowers, and only 23% of the votes go to the US or go to the West. And US did not invest at all in the Asian Infrastructure Bank. So the US actually gave no money to this AIB, basically said, we're not in. Actually, I'm not even sure, were they invited? I don't know. But Germany is the biggest Western donor for the AIB at about 4 or 5%. So have the multilateral development banks, so countries in general are fairly happy with the existence of more banks and more lending. Has the private sector responded to this new activity? I assume that it has to some extent. I don't know. So one of the main arguments was that these multilateral development banks will either help countries get to a level whereby the private sector begins to become interested. It sees the success and it wants to get on board. And I imagine that has happened in some cases. Private banks, they make decisions based on getting returns, on getting a return on their investment, seeing their money come back. My belief though is in general that these multilateral development banks are going to be fairly limited in their ability to generate 100%, all of the resources necessary for development, particularly coming from the private sector, because as I mentioned, the private sector wants returns of investment. And I do not believe under a global capitalist system, the way we have it, that you are going to have regions in every country around the world generating sufficient profits that warrant, cheap private sector investment. I just don't think it's going to happen. You can say that's my ideology, but I mean, I think that's pretty, the historical record is on my side, and I just do not think that in a competitive world economy, if there's going to be some places that are more profitable than others, that is where private lending is likely to go. It's not going to go to the bottom billion. It's not going to go to the poorest countries. So I think this will always have kind of limitations, but in general, it is making, by definition, more resources available that were not there before. So it might be a stepping stone for some countries, but definitely not all countries, and definitely not all people within all countries. That's my socialist dribble. So what else did I want to say? I had some notes here on the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. So I had just mentioned that the United States said, someone within the United States said, this is a moment we've lost control of the world. It's all over for us. And China, we have mentioned, they have that one road, one belt project, basically a $1 trillion plan across 60, 70 countries to unite, put China at the center of the global economic system, right? To connect China with infrastructure to Central Asia, to Europe, to Turkey, to make a maritime Silk Road to Africa, but basically to create the infrastructure needed for Chinese companies to export where they want cheaply and effectively around the world, and to import for the growing middle classes of China the products and the resources they need for consumption and to also generate more economic activity. So in 2016, the AIB Board of Directors approved the bank's first 4 projects, all of which were power, transportation, and urban development projects along the One Belt, One Road route. So these banks, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank and the New Development Bank, are definitely playing into some geopolitical interests. But that being said, so were World Bank projects. So I think these multilateral development banks, whether they're going, they're trying to promote private capital in China or Brazil or Russia or the United States or Germany, they're all promoting this vision of kind of a private sector, market-oriented, export-oriented development. And you'll remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the World Bank and the IMF and how this neoliberal period of structural adjustment was just brutal. So when countries, got into a tough spot, the IMF stepped in, said, we're going to help you out with this lending, but you've got to adjust to the new market realities. Foreign direct investment, you got to open up to trade, you've got to minimize your government, you've got to do all of this stuff to basically ensure that global capital, the global economy can continuously grow. And your role is to adjust to that reality so that you can get, and when you adjust, though the argument when, it wasn't saying you're going to be poor, you're going to be rich, because you're screwing it up right now by becoming involved. But if you look at the multilateral development banks now, what is so different? Yes, there is that progressive language of sustainability, of human development. You have to invest in some education, you have to invest in some health. But at the center of this is still that same idea that you need kind of global economic competition. You need free trade. There's this parallel discourse also going on of regional integration and regional trade. At the same time, there's this kind of discourse of global free trade as well. But all that to say is that these organizations, these banks, are definitely promoting, market expansion, capitalist accumulation. And their goal is that, or their ideas are that through this, everything else is going to become possible. All that other stuff is going to be held possible, or going to be possible. But, you know, for how long will that be the case? You know, is this just another trend? Are things going to get more severe and get a little bit more pro-market and anti-human, anti-sustainable in the coming years? That remains to be seen. So looking at my notes, yeah, I think that's probably pretty good for now. That's just a brief look at the multilateral development banks. They have, of course, have given a little bit more power and authority and flexibility to countries in the South. They've created some more opportunities for some more market options, I guess, for borrowers out there to pursue development. But definitely there's a prioritization out there for private sector, market, and particularly export-oriented development. So next section, we're going to look a little bit at these regional organizations, look at this concept of global governance and regional integration, and that's going to conclude our video series on South-South cooperation. Thanks a lot.